The cold did not ask permission before it broke a person. Rose had learned that truth long before the twins were born, before the mountains became her home, before the pine forests swallowed every trace of the life she had once tried to build inside the walls of Veldmore Keep. She had learned it the night Cassian stood before her in the great hall, his ice-blue eyes hard as iron, his voice carrying across stone and silence and the watching faces of every noble in the pack. "I reject you, Rose of the Ashvin bloodline. You are unworthy of the title of Luna. You are unworthy of me." She still heard those words sometimes, carried on the wind between the spruce trees, threading through the smoke of her morning fire like a ghost that refused to settle. But that was 3 years ago, and ghosts, she had decided, could not survive the mountain winter. Only the living could do that. The morning Rose noticed the strangers on the eastern ridge began like every other morning in the high country. She rose before the light, pulling her wool tunic over her linen underdress, lacing the front with practiced fingers that moved even in the dark. Her gray cloak, thick, worn soft at the hem from years of brushing against rock and root. She fastened at her collarbone with the small iron clasp shaped like a crescent moon. It had been her mother's. It was the only thing she had carried away from Veldmore without permission. The fire in the stone hearth had burned low during the night, and she coaxed it back with dry pine kindling and breath, kneeling on the cold floor while the cabin around her held its silence. Outside, the sky was still the deep gray of a world not yet decided on the day. Frost had crept along the inside of the shutters, and when Rose pressed her fingertips to the wood, she felt the bite of it travel up her hand and settle in her wrist. She stood, moved to the small room beyond the main hearth, and listened. 2 sets of breathing. Slow and even. She pulled the rough-hewn door open just enough to look inside. The twins lay curled together on their shared pallet, their dark hair, black as river-soaked wood, fanned across the sheepskin blanket she had traded an entire season of dried herbs to obtain from the traveling merchant who passed through the valley each autumn. Their lashes rested against their cheeks. Their small hands were loosely clasped between them, even in sleep, as if even unconscious they refused to let go of each other, Etta and Finn. 3 years old, and already more wolf than she had ever been permitted to be. Rose pulled the door closed and returned to the fire. She did not let herself think about whose eyes Finn carried. Ice blue, clear as a frozen stream, startling against the dark complexion he and his sister shared. She had spent the first year of their lives telling herself it meant nothing. Eyes came in all colors. Bloodlines were unpredictable. The moon goddess worked in patterns no mortal could fully trace. By the 2nd year, she had simply stopped looking directly into them. She filled the iron pot from the water barrel, hung it over the fire, and began cutting the last of the winter root vegetables on the wooden board beside the hearth. The knife was old but kept sharp. She had a whetstone and used it every 3 days, a habit she had developed because the mountain did not forgive dullness in tools or in people. The stew would last the morning. By afternoon, she would need to check the snare lines on the northern slope. It was while she was pulling on her boots near the door, the leather stiff with cold, that she heard it. Movement. On the ridge above the tree line. Rose went still. Her hands paused on the laces. Her wolf stirred, that quiet presence inside her chest that had never been strong. Omegas were not built for dominance, she had been told her entire life, but had always been steady, reliable. A small, warm ember that never went out, no matter how many times the world blew hard against it. The ember flared now. She pressed herself to the shuttered window and put her eye to the narrow gap between the boards. The light was growing, pale and flat, and the snow on the upper ridge caught it early, turning silver-white. Against that brightness, she counted 4 shapes moving through the tree line. Large, deliberate, not deer, not elk. The posture was wrong, too upright, too coordinated. Wolves. but not in their shifted forms. Men. Warriors. Her stomach dropped. She recognized the black and copper coloring of their cloaks before anything else. Every pack in the Northern Territories knew those colors. You learned them the way you learned the call of a hawk overhead, not because you admired it, but because you needed to know whether to run. Veldmore Royal Guard. No. The thought moved through her like ice water. No. Not here. Not now. She stepped back from the window, her heart loud in her own ears. 3 years. 3 years she had chosen this valley precisely because no trade road touched it, because the mountain pass above closed with snow for 6 months of the year, because no sane courier would cross it for anything short of war. She had been invisible. She had been careful. Her eyes moved to the closed door of the twins' room. The pot bubbled gently over the fire. The morning light was growing at the shutters. Outside, the 4 guards were descending the ridge, moving toward the valley floor with the unhurried confidence of men who were not lost, who were not wandering, men who had been told exactly where to go. And behind them, still at the top of the ridge, barely visible through the spruce branches heavy with last night's snowfall, stood a 5th figure, taller than the guards, broader, a black fur mantle across his shoulders. Dark braids swept back from a face she could not yet read at this distance. Leather armor crossed with heavy buckled straps that caught the early light. Rose's breath left her body. She would have known the shape of him anywhere. She had spent 3 years learning to forget it. Her hand found the iron clasp at her throat without thinking. Her mother's crescent moon, cold under her fingers. And she held it the way a drowning person holds a rope. He found us. The thought was not a question. It was not even fear, not yet. It was something older and quieter, and more dangerous than fear. It was the moment before everything changes. She had perhaps 10 minutes before they reached her door. Rose turned from the window, straightened her spine, pressed her palms flat against her thighs until they steadied. Then she walked to the twins' door, opened it gently, and sat on the edge of the pallet. "Etta," she said softly. "Finn. Wake up, little wolves. We need to be brave today." Finn's ice-blue eyes opened first, and for one terrible, breathless moment, Rose felt the full weight of 3 years of silence crashing down around her like a fortress wall. Rose had rehearsed this moment in the darkest hours of winter nights, when the wind screamed down from the peaks and the fire burned low, and she lay awake listening to the twins breathe. She had rehearsed it the way a soldier rehearses a retreat, not with hope, but with the cold discipline of someone who refuses to be caught unprepared. She had told herself, "If they ever come, you will be calm. You will be a wall. You will give them nothing." But Finn was looking up at her with those eyes, sleep-warm and trusting, and Etta had already reached for her hand with small fingers that smelled of wood smoke and wool, and every rehearsed wall Rose had ever built crumbled quietly into the cold morning air. She breathed. Once. Twice. "Stay inside," she told them, her voice low and even. "Do not open this door unless I call your name. Do you understand me?" Etta, who had always been the quicker of the two to read her mother's face, sat up straight and nodded without a word. She was 3 years old, and already had the careful stillness of someone twice that age. Finn watched Rose with those unsettling blue eyes, then pulled the sheepskin blanket up to his chin and nodded as well. Rose closed the door. She crossed the main room, lifted the wooden bar from the front door, and stepped outside before the guards could reach the threshold and take the initiative from her. She would not be dragged out. She would not be surprised on her own ground. The cold hit her like a flat hand. The valley air in early morning carried the scent of frozen pine resin, wood smoke from her chimney, and beneath it all, the sharp mineral smell of fresh snow on stone. Her boots crunched through the top crust of ice as she walked 3 steps from the door and stopped, pulling her gray cloak tight across her chest. The 4 guards halted 10 paces away, They were big men, armed with short swords at their hips and long spears carried upright, the iron tips catching the pale light. Their black and copper cloaks were heavy with travel dust beneath the snow. They had been riding hard. One of them had a long scar that crossed his jaw and disappeared into the collar of his armor. He looked at Rose with the flat, assessing gaze of a man who had been ordered to retrieve something and intended to do exactly that. None of them spoke. They were waiting for him. Rose heard the snow crunch behind the guards before she saw him move between them. He walked with the same measured, unhurried weight she remembered. The kind of stride that came not from arrogance, but from a lifetime of never needing to hurry, because nothing in the world had ever been faster than him. The black fur mantle across his shoulders was dusted with snow at the edges. His dark braids were pulled back from his face with a leather cord, and a few loose strands had come free during the descent, resting against his jaw. There was a thin scar she did not recognize on his left cheekbone, new or new enough. His leather armor was the deep black of Veldmore's royal guard, but finer, the straps buckled in bronze rather than iron, and his eyes, ice blue, pale and clear and winter cold. Cassian, Alpha King of Veldmore, stood 5 paces from her door and looked at her across 3 years of silence. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Rose kept her chin level. She would not drop her gaze. Not because she felt any dominance pressing against his. She had no illusions about what her Omega status meant against an Alpha King. But because she had earned the right to stand here, on this land, in front of this door. She had carried wood and set snares and stitched wounds by firelight, and sung fever songs to 2 sick children through a winter so brutal it had killed 2 of her goats and cracked the stone of her outer wall. No one could take that from her with a stare. Rose. His voice was exactly as she remembered, low, unhurried, carrying the particular weight of a man accustomed to being obeyed. But there was something beneath it she did not recognize. A roughness, like a blade that had been used too much and not tended to. "Your Grace," she said. The title came out clean and flat, stripped of every emotion she had packed around it. His jaw tightened. Just slightly. She noticed. "You are difficult to find," he said. "That was the intention." One of the guards shifted his weight. Cassian did not look at the man, but the guard went still again immediately, the way a wolf pup goes still when the alpha breathes in its direction. "I need to speak with you," Cassian said. "You are speaking with me." Something moved behind his eyes. Frustration, perhaps, or something older and harder to name. He looked at the cabin behind her, at the smoke rising from the chimney, at the single row of dried herbs hanging under the eaves, at the small pair of boots left beside the door, barely larger than his fist. He looked at those boots for a moment longer than everything else. When he looked back at her, something in his face had shifted. Not softened exactly. Changed. The way ice changes when it begins to take in heat, from the inside out, invisible until it is nearly too late. "Invite me inside, Rose." It was not a request. It was not quite a command either. It lived in the strange territory between the two. And Rose understood that whatever ground she chose here would define every conversation that followed. "My lord," she said carefully, "whatever business brought you across the mountain pass in the last week of winter is business we can conduct here, in the open air. It is not that kind of business. Then tell me what kind it is." His eyes held hers. The wind moved between them, lifting a strand of her blonde braid across her cheek. She did not raise her hand to push it away. "The kind," he said, his voice dropping just enough that the guards could not hear, "that I will not discuss in front of my men." Rose studied him for 5 full seconds. She was looking for the thing she had always looked for in his face and rarely found. Honesty. Not performance. Not command. The real thing. Unguarded. She found something close to it now. and that frightened her more than his presence had. She stepped aside and gestured toward the door. Cassian moved past her, ducking slightly under the low door frame. She caught his scent as he passed, leather and pine resin and cold iron. And beneath all of it, something warm and dark she had spent 3 years trying to forget existed. She turned to the scarred guard. "Your men may shelter in the woodshed. There is a water barrel at the eastern wall." She kept her voice entirely calm. "They will not enter my home." The guard looked past her toward his king, and Cassian, without turning, said simply, "Do as she says." Rose followed Cassian inside and closed the door. He stood in the center of her small main room, filling it in a way that made the walls feel closer. His eyes moved over everything with the systematic attention of a man reading a map. The fire, the iron pot, the herbs, the wooden board with the knife, the single chair and the low stool, the 2 wooden bowls already set beside the hearth for the twins' morning meal. His gaze stopped there. 2 bowls. Rose stood by the door, her arms loose at her sides, her heartbeat controlled and deliberate. "You are well," he said. It was not quite a question. "I survive." "That is not the same thing." "No," she agreed. "It is not." The silence between them had texture. 3 years of letters never written, of roads not taken, of a rejection spoken aloud before witnesses and carved into the pack record in permanent ink. Rose felt it pressing against her ribs like a stone. Then, from behind the closed inner door, came the small, unmistakable sound of a child shifting on a pallet. A whisper. Then silence again. Cassian turned his head toward the sound. And Rose watched the Alpha King of Veldmore go absolutely, dangerously still. The stillness that came over Cassian was not the stillness of a man thinking. It was the stillness of a man whose entire world had just rearranged itself around a single sound, a child's whisper behind a closed door, and who had not yet decided what to do with the wreckage. Rose watched him. She did not move, did not speak. She had learned long ago that silence was the only territory an Omega could hold against an Alpha King, and she intended to hold every inch of it. Cassian's eyes remained on the inner door. The muscle in his jaw moved once, then was still. His hands, she noticed, had dropped to his sides and curled slowly, not into fists of anger, but into something more like a man gripping the edge of something he was afraid of falling from. "How old?" he said. His voice was very quiet. "That is not a conversation we are having right now." He turned to look at her. The ice blue of his eyes had changed. She had seen every version of Cassian's gaze across the years she had spent inside Veldmore's walls. Commanding, cold, calculating, occasionally something almost gentle that he always closed off before it could be named. She had never seen what she was looking at now. It was the expression of a man standing at the edge of a reckoning he had not prepared for. "Rose, sit down," she said. "Or stand. But understand that whatever reason you cross that mountain for, I will hear it first. Before anything else happens in this room, you will tell me why you came." He looked at her for a long moment. Then, with the careful deliberateness of someone choosing each movement with intention, he moved to the low stool near the fire and sat. The stool was absurdly small beneath him, built for her frame, not his. But he settled onto it with no trace of self-consciousness, resting his forearms on his knees, his dark braids falling forward slightly. Rose remained standing near the door. She crossed her arms over her chest, not in defiance, but because it was the only way to keep her hands from betraying her. "There is war coming to Veldmore," Cassian said. Whatever she had expected him to say, it was not that. "Lord Edric of the Stonemarsh Territories has been gathering alliances for 2 years, he continued, his voice settling into the measured cadence of a man recounting a problem he had been carrying alone for a very long time. 3 border packs have already bent the knee to him, His claim is that Veldmore's throne passes to the strongest alpha in the Northern Territories, not the one who holds the bloodline. That is not the old law, Rose said carefully. No. It is his law, invented to serve his purpose. A shadow crossed Cassian's face. He has a seer in his court, a woman who reads the old bones and speaks of a prophecy, that the Lycan king will fall to divided blood, that his line ends with him. He paused. It has given Edric's followers exactly the story they needed. Rose uncrossed her arms slowly. And you came here because the prophecy is wrong. Cassian's eyes moved back to the inner door. Or it was wrong. Until this morning, I was the last of my bloodline. There was no one to carry it forward. Edric's seer built her entire claim on that foundation. He was quiet for a moment. But there is another piece to the prophecy, one that Edric has apparently chosen not to share with his allies. He looked back at Rose. It says, "The king's line is not ended, but hidden, carried by the one he cast aside. And when those eyes look upon the throne, it will hold." The fire crackled between them. Rose felt the words settle over her like snowfall, slowly at first, then all at once, until the weight of them was impossible to ignore. "You came here because of a prophecy," she said. Her voice was steady. Her hands were not. She pressed them flat against her thighs. "I came here because I did something 3 years ago that I cannot undo," Cassian said. "And because the consequences of that act are larger than I understood when I committed it." He held her gaze. "And because I needed to see for myself." "See what?" "Whether what I suspected was true." He glanced again at the inner door. "Whether those 2 small bowls on your hearth meant what I thought they meant." Rose breathed carefully. "You had me followed." "I had the mountain passes watched for 2 years." He did not apologize for it. She had not expected him to. 7 months ago, a traveling herb merchant described a young woman with a blonde braid, living alone in the high valley with 2 dark-haired children. He remembered the children because one of them had eyes he had never seen before on a child that age. Cassian's voice dropped. He called them winter eyes. Said they looked like the sky before a storm. The silence stretched until it became almost unbearable. Cassian. She used his name, not his title, for the first time, and she watched him react to it the way a man reacts to cold water. Instantly, involuntarily. Whatever this prophecy means for Veldmore, whatever political problem my children represent for your war, they are my children. They live under my roof and under my protection, and no king's war, no lord's ambition, and no ancient bone reader's prophecy changes that. I know, he said. I am not finished. She stepped closer, close enough that he would have to look up at her, close enough that she could speak without the walls hearing. You stood in that great hall and you rejected me in front of every noble in the pack. You said I was unworthy. You had the record keeper mark it in permanent ink in the pack ledger. You ended whatever I was to you with 7 words, and you did not look back. Her voice did not shake. She had practiced this too, in the dark winter hours, though she had never imagined speaking it aloud. I built this life from nothing. I carried those children through a winter that would have broken most trained warriors. I am not interested in being a solution to your political problem. Cassian rose from the stool. He was close now, closer than she had permitted herself to think about, and the warmth that came off him was infuriating, because it was real. Not performed, not political, but the simple living warmth of another person standing very near in a cold room. I know what I said, he told her. The roughness in his voice was worse up close. I know what I did. I am not here to pretend otherwise, or to offer you words that make it smaller than it was. He paused. I am here because Edric's men are 3 weeks behind me, and when they arrive in this valley, they will not come to speak. Rose's blood went cold. "They know," she whispered. "The seer told him 3 days before I left Veldmore. I rode the moment I had the information." His jaw was tight. "Edric cannot let the bloodline hold. If my line continues, if those children exist and can be proven, his entire claim collapses. Every pack he gathered will scatter back to their own borders." His eyes held hers without flinching. "He will come here, Rose. He will come with swords, not words." From behind the inner door came the sound of small feet on the wooden floor. A pause. Then Finn's voice, muffled but clear. "Mama? Is someone there?" Rose turned toward the sound instinctively, every other thought in her body dropping away the moment she heard his voice. Behind her, she heard Cassian exhale, one long, unsteady breath that he had clearly been holding for some time. She turned back to look at him. His eyes were fixed on the inner door with an expression she had no name for, something raw and unfinished and entirely unguarded, the expression of a man who has just understood the full dimension of what he lost and has not yet learned how to exist inside that knowledge. Rose looked at him for a long moment. Then she crossed to the inner door, opened it, and stepped inside. 2 sets of dark eyes looked up at her from the pallet. Etta had already braided a small section of her own hair, badly, with fingers that were still learning the motion. Finn stood at the edge of the pallet in his wool sleep tunic, his ice blue eyes wide and curious, and entirely, devastatingly familiar. Rose knelt down to their level. "There is a man in our main room," she said quietly. "He is not going to hurt us. But I need you both to be brave and calm the way we practiced." She touched Etta's cheek, then Finn's. "Can you do that for me?" Etta nodded solemnly. Finn thought about it for exactly 2 seconds, that thoughtful hesitation that was so distinctly his own, and nodded. Rose stood, took a breath, and opened the door wider. The moment Finn stepped through into the firelight, Cassian saw his son's eyes for the first time, and the Alpha King of Veldmore, who had never bent before any man or any force in his kingdom, went completely and utterly still, as if the ground beneath him had shifted, and he was only now learning what solid earth actually felt like. No one moved. The fire crackled. A log shifted in the hearth, sending a brief shower of orange sparks upward into the chimney's throat. The smell of pine resin and root vegetable stew filled the small room, and outside, the wind had begun its slow morning climb down from the peaks, brushing against the shutters with a sound like distant breathing. Finn stood in the doorway between the 2 rooms and looked at Cassian with the open, uncomplicated curiosity of a child who had not yet learned to be afraid of large men. Etta stood half a step behind her brother, her small hand curled into the back of his sleep tunic, watching the stranger with considerably more caution. She had always been the one who observed first and decided later. Finn had always been the one who simply walked toward the thing that interested him. He was walking toward Cassian now. Rose's breath caught in her throat. She did not reach out to stop him. She understood, with the deep bone certainty of someone who had spent 3 years learning to read her children's natures, that stopping Finn in this moment would only make the meeting more fraught. He was not afraid. He was curious. And curiosity, in a wolf child, was sacred. Cassian had not moved. He stood in the center of the room with his arms loose at his sides, his entire massive frame utterly still, as if any sudden movement might shatter something irreplaceable. His ice-blue eyes tracked Finn's approach with an expression Rose had never seen on him before, and could not fully name. It was layered, tangled, something that lived between wonder and grief, and a guilt so deep it had no clean surface. Finn stopped 2 feet in front of him and looked up. The height difference was almost absurd. The child barely reached the man's knee, but Finn tilted his head back without a single trace of intimidation and studied Cassian's face with the focused, serious attention he usually reserved for particularly interesting beetles and the shapes clouds made over the northern peaks. "You are very big," Finn said. Something moved across Cassian's face. Not quite a smile. Something more fragile and more honest than that. "I have been told," he said. "Your hair is like mine." Finn reached up and touched one of his own dark curls, then pointed at Cassian's braids. "But longer." "It is." Cassian's voice was lower than it had been all morning, quieter, stripped of its command weight entirely. Etta, from the doorway, studied this exchange with narrowed eyes. She looked at Rose. Rose gave her a small nod. "It is all right. Watch. You are safe." And Etta looked back at the stranger, her expression shifting from wariness to the kind of careful assessment that reminded Rose painfully of the man standing before her. "Who are you?" Finn asked. The question landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Rose felt the ripples of it move through her chest and settle somewhere deep and aching. Cassian was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, he chose his words with a deliberateness that suggested he understood exactly how much weight they carried. "I am someone who knew your mother," he said. "A long time ago, before you were born." Finn considered this with great seriousness. "Did you make her sad?" The silence that followed was the longest Rose had ever endured in a small room. Cassian did not look at her. He kept his eyes on Finn, and the muscle in his jaw moved. And when he spoke again, his voice had a roughness in it that had nothing to do with authority, and everything to do with a man being held accountable by a 3-year-old in a wool sleep tunic. "Yes," he said. "I did." Finn absorbed this. He looked at his mother, then back at Cassian. "Are you going to say sorry?" Etta made a small sound from the doorway that might, in another context, have been a laugh immediately suppressed. Rose pressed her fingers to her mouth briefly and looked at the ceiling. Cassian crouched down, slowly, carefully, until he was closer to Finn's eye level, though he was still enormous even folded in half. Up close like this, the resemblance was breathtaking and merciless. The same dark coloring, the same structure in the brow and jaw, still soft with childhood but carrying its future shape already. And those eyes, identical in color, looking at each other across 3 years of a mistake that had cost more than Cassian had ever calculated when he made it. "I am going to try," Cassian said quietly. "Saying sorry is only the beginning. After that comes the work." Finn considered him for another long moment with those old, serious eyes. Then he turned and walked back to Etta, took his sister's hand, and looked at Rose with an expression that clearly meant, "Your turn, Mama." Rose almost smiled despite herself. She fed the twins their morning stew and settled them near the fire with the wooden carved animals she had traded for at the autumn market. A small wolf, a stag, a bear, a hawk, and turned to face Cassian properly. He had moved to the far side of the room, giving the children space with an instinctive tact she had not expected from him. He stood near the shelves where she kept her bundles of dried herbs, yarrow, wolfsbane treated carefully for healing use, dried pine bark, moss compresses, and studied them without touching, his hands clasped behind his back. "You have been practicing as a healer," he said. "Surviving requires skills." She kept her voice low so the twins would not follow the conversation. "Talk to me about Edric. How many men does he command?" Cassian turned from the shelves. He seemed almost relieved to have a problem with clean edges to discuss. 400 swords under his direct command. Another 160 pledged from the Ironfoot Pack to his east. His beta, a man named Corvus, is the real military mind. Edric provides the ambition. Corvus provides the strategy. And Veldmore? 320 trained soldiers. Another 80 guards at the keep. He paused. The numbers are not the problem. Veldmore's warriors are better trained and better armed. The problem is legitimacy. 3 border packs have already accepted Edric's claim that my bloodline is ended. If I march against him with a weakened claim, even a military victory becomes unstable. Other lords will see an opening. It never stops. Rose was quiet for a moment. So you need the children to be publicly known. I need them to be safe, he said. The correction was immediate and genuine. The political value is real. I will not lie to you about that. But it is not why I rode 12 days in winter cold. He met her eyes steadily. I did not know. Rose, I need you to understand that. When I made that decision in the Great Hall, I did not know. Would it have changed things? She asked it without cruelty, but without softness either. It was a real question, and she needed a real answer. He was silent for long enough that she respected him for it. He did not reach for the easy answer. He sat with the hard one. I want to say yes, he finally said. I believe it would have, but I cannot stand here and tell you with certainty, because the man I was 3 years ago made that choice for reasons I am still ashamed of, and shame does not lend itself to clean answers. Rose looked at him for a long time. Outside the shutters, the wind was building, carrying with it the smell of coming snow. That particular sharp, cold scent that arrived a few hours before the clouds. She had learned to read that smell the same way she read everything else in this valley, with attention and respect. There is a woman in my valley, Rose said. Her name is Sana. She's a beta widow, sharp as a tack and twice as stubborn, and she has been my only neighbor for 2 years. She has a fast horse and knows the back trails through the Ashfen forest better than anyone living. She moved to the hearth, checked the fire, then straightened. If Edric's men are 3 weeks out, we have time to move, but only if we plan it correctly. You are thinking about running, Cassian said. I am thinking about surviving. She looked at him. There is a difference, and I learned it from experience. I am not asking you to run. He stepped closer, and his voice dropped further, carrying only to her. I am asking you to come back to Veldmore, with me, under the protection of the crown. A pause. I am asking you to let me do what I should have done 3 years ago. Rose felt those words move through her the way cold water moves through a body, reaching places she had long since closed off, finding them against her will. That is a very large ask, she said carefully. I know. You cannot simply walk back into my life and my children's lives and rearrange everything because a prophecy and a political enemy have made it convenient. I know that too. He held her gaze. I am not asking because it is convenient. I am asking because it is right, and because... He stopped himself, jaw tightening, then continued with the careful effort of someone saying a true thing that does not come easily. Because standing in this room this morning, watching my son ask me if I made you sad, I understood what I threw away. Completely. For the first time. The fire popped. Etta had arranged all 4 carved animals in a precise row and was explaining their hierarchy to Finn in a whisper, pointing at each one in turn with a small authoritative finger. Rose watched her daughter. She thought about the mountain road, about Edric's swords, 3 weeks behind, about a seer who had built a war on the premise that Cassian's blood had no future. She thought about the 3 years she had spent making herself into someone the mountain could not break. She thought about the crescent moon clasp at her throat, cold under her fingers every morning, and about the question she had never let herself ask aloud. What does the rest of this life look like if I keep choosing only survival? From across the room, Finn looked up from the carved animals directly at Cassian with those impossible eyes, and smiled for the first time. A small, tentative, genuinely offered thing. Cassian looked at that smile as if it were the first warm light after the longest winter of his life. Rose closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, she had made nothing close to a decision. But the wall inside her chest, the one she had built stone by stone over 3 years of cold mornings and hard choices, had developed without her permission, a single crack. Sina arrived before midday. Rose had sent word through the youngest of Cassian's guards, a lean, quiet young man named Aldrich, who had the decency to look apologetic about the entire situation, asking her neighbor to come quickly and to bring her traveling pack. Sina lived a quarter-hour's walk down the valley in a low stone cottage that she had rebuilt herself after her husband's death, and she moved through the mountain terrain with the unhurried efficiency of a woman who had long since made peace with hard country. She arrived at Rose's door with a worn leather pack across one shoulder, a short hunting knife at her hip, and an expression that shifted through several distinct stages the moment she stepped inside and registered Cassian's presence. First, recognition. Sina was not a woman who missed details, and the black and copper cloaks of the guards visible through the open door had already told her most of the story. Second, fury. Brief, hot, entirely on Rose's behalf. Third, the careful, deliberate composure of a woman who understood that fury, however justified, was a luxury for later. She set her pack down beside the door, crossed to Rose, and looked at her with dark eyes that asked 100 questions in complete silence. "We need to move," Rose told her quietly. 3 weeks, perhaps less. Sina glanced at Cassian with the particular expression she usually reserved for whether she did not trust. "And him?" "He is the reason we need to move," Rose said, "and also, currently, our best option for surviving it." Sina absorbed this with remarkable composure. She looked at the twins, who were still arranged near the hearth with their carved animals. Edda had now given each animal a name and a territory, and was conducting what appeared to be a small diplomatic assembly, and then back at Cassian. "You are the one who rejected her," Sina said to him. It was not a question. Cassian met her gaze without flinching. "Yes." "In front of witnesses, in writing." "Yes." Sina was quiet for a moment. "Then you had better be very certain about what you are doing now," she said, "because these children know this mountain. They know this valley. They know that smoke and that fire and the sound of that wind. Uprooting them is not a small thing. Uprooting her is not a small thing." She held his eyes steadily. "I will not watch her be broken a second time." Something in Cassian's expression shifted. Not defensiveness, but the sober, unflinching acknowledgement of a man receiving a fair warning and choosing to receive it fully rather than deflect it. "Neither will I," he said. Sina studied him for another long moment. Then she looked at Rose. "How much do we pack?" They spent the remainder of the morning preparing. Rose moved through her small cabin with the focused calm of someone packing not just objects, but chapters of a life carefully chosen. She wrapped the dried herbs in oilcloth and packed them in the bottom of her traveling chest. She folded the twins' wool tunics and sheepskin blankets with deliberate care. She took the whetstone, the small iron cooking pot, the tin of rendered fat she used for wound salves, and the leather-bound journal she had kept through 3 years of mountain seasons, remedies, observations, drawings of plants in the margins made with a stick of charcoal. She did not pack the rejection document. She had burned it the night she arrived in the valley, standing in the snow, watching the ink curl and blacken and become ash, and that had been the right decision, and she had never questioned it. She took her mother's crescent moon clasp from her throat, held it for a moment in her palm, then fastened it back in place. Cassian's guards loaded the supply horses with quiet efficiency. Aldrich, the young guard, helped Sina secure her own pack without being asked, which earned him a single approving nod that Rose suspected was the highest accolade Sina had ever awarded a stranger. Cassian himself did not direct the loading. He stood outside the cabin in the cold morning air and watched Rose move between her shelves, and when she came to the doorway with the traveling chest and found him there, he took it from her hands without a word and carried it to the horses himself. She let him. It was not forgiveness. It was not even the beginning of forgiveness. But it was the acknowledgement that a person could carry their own weight and still accept help when a road was long. They left the valley as the midday light peaked and began its slow decline. Rose walked with Etta's hand in her left and Finn's in her right, their small boots making quick prints in the snow beside the deep marks of the horses' hooves. The cabin behind them grew smaller as the trail curved upward through the spruce trees. Rose did not look back. She had made that rule for herself the night she arrived, no looking back, and she intended to keep it on the way out as well. Finn looked back. He was, she had accepted, constitutionally incapable of not looking at interesting things, and the cabin behind them was interesting because it was becoming small, and small things fascinated him. He tugged her hand. "Will our house be there when we come back?" he asked. Rose thought about how to answer that honestly and gently at the same time. "I do not know yet, little wolf, but we are carrying everything important with us." He considered this. Even the carved wolf? Even the carved wolf. It is in the chest. Satisfied, he turned forward again. Etta said nothing. She walked with her small chin level and her eyes forward, and occasionally she glanced sideways at Cassian, who was riding slowly at the front of the group, to allow the children to set the pace. Etta had the look of someone constructing a very thorough internal assessment, and not yet ready to share her conclusions. Cassian rode in silence. He did not attempt conversation. He did not try to insert himself into the quiet rhythm Rose had established with her children. But twice, when the trail narrowed and the snow deepened, Rose saw him slow his horse and angle it slightly to the side, creating a windbreak for the children without drawing attention to the fact that he was doing it. She noticed. She said nothing. They made camp that first night in a shallow cave system Rose knew from her first year in the mountains, a place where the rock held the cold back just enough to make a fire worthwhile. The guard set a perimeter without being told, and Aldrich proved himself further by producing, from somewhere in his pack, a small packet of dried fruit that he offered to the twins with such awkward sincerity that Etta accepted it with the gracious solemnity of a small queen receiving tribute. After the children had eaten and been settled into their blankets against the warmest part of the cave wall, Rose sat near the fire, and Cassian sat across from her, and between them, the flames made shifting patterns on the stone. Sina was ostensibly sharpening her knife nearby. Rose understood she was also listening, and loved her for it. "Tell me about Corvus," Rose said. "You said he is the strategic mind. What does he want?" Cassian looked at her across the fire. He had let his braids down, and his dark hair fell loose around his jaw, and the firelight made shadows of his cheekbones. He looked less like a king in this moment, and more like a man who was very tired, and had been tired for a long time. "Power," he said, "but specific power. He does not want Edric's throne. Corvus is a beta. He has no bloodline claim. What he wants is the position behind the throne, the voice that shapes decisions. Edric is arrogant and impulsive and easy to manage if you are patient and clever enough." He turned a small stick over in his fingers. "Corvus has been patient and clever for 15 years. He was the one who found the seer," Rose said. It was not a question. Cassian looked up at her. "How did you—" "Because the seer's prophecy is too useful," Rose said. "A genuine prophecy is rarely so politically convenient. It had to be constructed, or at minimum interpreted, by someone with a purpose." She looked at the fire. "The bone readers I knew in Veldmore's lower quarter were honest women. They spoke what they saw, and what they saw was rarely clear. This prophecy is too clean, too linear. Someone shaped it." Cassian was quiet for a moment. "You were paying attention," he said. There was something in his voice that was neither surprise nor flattery. It was closer to recognition, the particular recognition of a man realizing that the person before him had always been more than his limited view of her allowed. "I was always paying attention," Rose said. "I simply had no one who wanted to hear it." The fire shifted between them. Somewhere in the cave, Finn made a small sleep sound and was quiet again. "There is something else," Cassian said after a moment. His voice had changed. Lower, carrying the particular weight of a thing he had been deciding whether to say for some time. Corvus knows about the prophecy's second half, the part about the king's hidden line. He set down the stick. Which means he knows that if I arrive in Veldmore with the children, with proof of the bloodline continuing, his entire construction falls apart. He will not wait 3 weeks, Rose said. The cold certainty of it moved through her like the valley wind. If he realizes you found us, he already knows I left Veldmore in a hurry. Cassian's jaw tightened. I may have less time than I told you. Across the fire, Sina's knife sharpening paused for exactly 1 second. Rose looked at the sleeping shapes of her children against the cave wall. Edda's small braid dark against the sheepskin. Finn's face peaceful and open, his ice-blue eyes closed against dreams she could not follow him into. She had kept them safe for 3 years with silence and distance and the cold indifference of the mountain. Those tools were no longer enough. She looked at Cassian. The firelight moved in his eyes. All that blue, impossible to look at directly, impossible to look away from. Then we ride at first light, she said, and you tell me everything about Corvus that you know. Every habit, every preference, every weakness. Her voice was steady and quiet and entirely certain. Because if this war reaches my children, it will not find them undefended. Cassian looked at her across the fire for a long moment, and in his expression she saw, for the first time, not a king assessing a situation. She saw a man who had just understood that the woman he had once called unworthy was, in every way that mattered, the strongest person in this cave. Everything, he said. I will tell you everything. And outside, the mountain wind moved through the spruce trees and carried the first faint promise of dawn in its cold, clean breath. And somewhere far below the ridge, 3 weeks of distance began, very quietly, to shorten.